Bigfoot may be in your DNA. Yes, I know this sounds crazy, but let me explain. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't based on campfire stories or blurry trail cam footage or some guy who swears he saw something moving between the trees at dusk. This comes from peer-reviewed genetic research, published in major scientific journals and covered by the Smithsonian Institution. And once you hear the full picture, you're going to look at every Bigfoot story you've ever dismissed in a completely different light. In 2019, a team of researchers used artificial intelligence to scan the entire human genome. They were looking for traces of ancient interbreeding between modern humans and other archaic hominin species. This is the kind of thing geneticists do all the time now. We know that our ancestors interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, and those genetic traces are still detectable in living people today. But when the AI finished its analysis, it flagged something nobody expected. Buried deep inside the DNA of modern, living, breathing human beings, the system found genetic traces of a completely unknown species. Not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, something else entirely. A species that science has no name for, no fossils for, and no bones for anywhere on Earth. The researchers didn't know what to call it, so they gave it the only name they could. They called it a ghost population. Then in 2020, a study out of UCLA confirmed it and took it even further. Researchers found that between 2 and 19% of certain people's genomes contain DNA from a species that split from the human lineage over 1 million years ago. Let that number sink in for a second. 19%. That's not some barely detectable trace buried so deep in the genetic code that you need a supercomputer to find it. That's a massive chunk of someone's entire genetic identity coming from a species that officially does not exist. There is genetic code inside living, breathing people right now, walking around, going to work, picking up their kids from school, cooking dinner, watching television. That belongs to a species we have never identified. No skeleton has ever been found, no skull, no jawbone, no finger bone. No remains of any kind anywhere in the world. This species exists only as code written into people's blood. Now here's where this gets truly unsettling. What if someone actually went looking for the people carrying the highest concentrations of this unknown DNA? What if they found them living exactly where you'd expect them to be if the ghost population was what I think it is? Deep in the most remote, forested, mountainous terrain in the country. And what if the answer to what this ghost population really was turned out to be something the entire scientific community refuses to even consider? That's exactly what happened to a university geneticist working in rural Appalachia. And what he found didn't just challenge his understanding of science, it terrified him. It terrified him because it meant that Bigfoot isn't just a creature that might be hiding in the woods. It means Sasquatch might be hiding in our chromosomes. Before I get into his story, I need to make sure you understand the science behind this because it's the foundation of everything that follows. And it's what makes this different from every other Bigfoot story you've ever heard. When we talk about archaic hominin DNA in modern humans, what we mean is this. Tens of thousands of years ago, modern humans didn't have the planet to themselves. There were other species of early humans walking the earth at the same time. Neanderthals lived across Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans occupied parts of Eastern Asia and Oceania. And when these different species encountered each other, they didn't always compete or fight. Sometimes they formed relationships. Sometimes they had children together. And those children carried genetic material from both parent species. Over thousands of generations, those traces got passed down through family lines, diluted, but never fully erased until they ended up in the DNA of people alive today. This is well-established mainstream science, it's taught in universities, it's published in the most respected journals in the world. Most people of European descent carry about 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. If you're of European heritage, there is a very real chance that a small piece of your genetic code came from a Neanderthal who lived 40,000 years ago. Melanesian and Southeast Asian populations carry detectable amounts of Denisovan DNA. We know all of this because we've found Neanderthal and Denisovan fossils, extracted their DNA from ancient bones, sequenced their genomes, and compared them to modern humans. The genetic matches are clear and undeniable. But here's the problem. When the AI scanned modern human genomes in 2019, it flagged genetic sequences that didn't match Neanderthal DNA. They didn't match Denisovan DNA either. They didn't match anything in the fossil record at all. The sequences were too genetically distinct from any known species to be classified. The AI essentially said there is something in here that came from a species we have never seen before. Not in a museum, not in a dig site, not in any fossil collection anywhere on the planet. And this wasn't a minor statistical anomaly that could be waved away as noise in the data. This was a clear, repeatable, verifiable signal showing up consistently across multiple populations. The Smithsonian covered this research extensively. This wasn't fringe science published in some obscure journal that nobody reads. This was mainstream genetics, confirmed by one of the most respected scientific institutions in the world. And the UCLA study the following year went even further. They didn't just confirm the existence of this unknown DNA, they quantified it. They mapped its distribution across populations. And they found that in certain groups of people, up to 19% of the genome comes from this unidentified source. That number matters enormously. 19% is not a trace amount. It's not some ancient whisper left over from a single encounter hundreds of thousands of years ago. That's a massive genetic contribution, and it implies sustained, repeated, ongoing contact between humans and this unknown species over thousands upon thousands of years. Whatever this species was, it was intelligent enough, adaptable enough, and geographically widespread enough to maintain breeding contact with human populations across vast stretches of time and territory. Think about what that means for a moment. We live in an age where we can sequence the entire human genome in a matter of hours. We have mapped the DNA of species that went extinct 40,000 years ago, using fragments of bone pulled from cave floors. We have identified every major archaic hominin species that contributed to the modern human gene pool, or so we thought. And yet sitting right there in the chromosomes of millions of living people is a genetic signature from something that doesn't match any known species, living or dead, anywhere in the scientific record. It's as if you opened the hood of a car and found a part that doesn't match any manufacturer, any model, any era of automotive engineering. You'd want to know where that part came from. You'd want to know who made it. And the honest answer from science right now is we have no idea. And here's the detail that nobody seemed to want to talk about. The concentrations aren't evenly distributed. Some populations carry almost none of this ghost DNA. Others carry enormous amounts. The variation isn't random either. It follows geographic patterns. But the published researchers attributed it to isolation, genetic drift, and sampling variation. Standard explanations, safe explanations, the kind of explanations that don't end careers. But one geneticist looked at that uneven distribution and saw something different. He saw a pattern, and he decided to go looking for it. He was a university researcher in his mid-30s working in population genetics at a research university in the Southeast. His specialty was ancestry mapping for underserved rural communities. These were people who had never had access to consumer genetic testing. families who had been rooted in the same areas for centuries with deep, unbroken lineage and almost no outside migration. He ran a grant-funded project offering free ancestry DNA analysis to communities in rural Appalachia. The hollers and valleys and mountain communities where families had been living in the same places for 200 years or more, where the same last names appear on mailboxes and headstones and church registries going back to before the Civil War. The project was straightforward. Collect saliva samples, run them through ancestry databases, give families their heritage breakdown, publish a paper on genetic diversity in isolated American populations. He had done this kind of work dozens of times across multiple states, and nothing unusual had ever come up. The results were always predictable, until he got to one particular community in a remote hollow in West Virginia. The hollow sat deep in the mountains, accessed by a single unpaved road that wound through dense forest for miles before it finally opened into a narrow valley hemmed in on all sides by steep, forested ridges. The kind of place where cell service doesn't reach, and the nearest town with a grocery store is an hour's drive over rough roads. People there still heated exclusively with wood stoves. Many drew water from wells. Some of the older homes didn't have running water at all. The community was small, maybe 40 or 50 families total, and most of them had been there since before anyone kept reliable written records. They were friendly enough to outsiders, but clearly not accustomed to seeing them. When the geneticist arrived with his collection kits and consent forms and university identification badge, people were curious but noticeably guarded. They answered his questions but didn't volunteer information. They signed the consent forms but didn't read them with enthusiasm. It was clear that outsiders coming into the hollow with clipboards and official-looking paperwork was not a normal occurrence and not an entirely welcome one either. The hollow itself had a quality to it that the geneticist found hard to describe in his field notes. The forest surrounding the community was old growth, with trees so tall and thick that the canopy blocked most of the sunlight even at midday. The air smelled different than the surrounding countryside, heavier, damper, with an organic richness that spoke of centuries of undisturbed decomposition on the forest floor. Sounds carried strangely in the valley. Voices echoed off the ridges in ways that made it hard to tell where they originated. At night, the darkness was absolute. No streetlights, no ambient glow from nearby towns, nothing. Just the kind of pure, crushing blackness that most modern people never experience. And in that darkness, sounds came from the surrounding forest that the geneticist couldn't identify and that the locals didn't seem to notice, or at least pretended not to. One family in particular caught his attention before he ever ran a single sample. They lived furthest up the mountain at the very end of the road where the pavement gave way to dirt, and the dirt eventually gave way to a footpath that disappeared into the trees. The other residents in the hollow spoke about this family differently, not with hostility, but with a careful, almost instinctive distance. Comments like they keep to themselves, and they've always been a little different, spoken in lowered voices with glances toward the mountain, as if the family might somehow hear from a mile away. Several people mentioned without being asked that the family was unusually large in physical stature. The men were described as well over 6 feet tall, some pushing close to 7, broad-shouldered, barrel-chested, with heavy brow ridges and deep-set eyes that gave them an intense, almost unsettling gaze. One older woman in the community said her grandmother used to call them the mountain people, and not because they lived on the mountain. She said it like the name meant something deeper, something older, but she wouldn't elaborate no matter how gently the geneticist pressed. The family agreed to participate in the study. They were polite, but gave almost nothing away. They answered questions with the fewest possible words and watched the geneticist with a quiet, unblinking intensity. that made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't threatening exactly. It was more like being watched by something that was evaluating you in ways you didn't fully understand. He collected their samples along with everyone else's, packed everything into his cooler, shipped the batch to the lab, and went home. He expected nothing remarkable. He was about to be very, very wrong. When the ancestry results came back a few weeks later, most families in the hollows showed exactly what he predicted. Standard Appalachian heritage, Scots-Irish and English with minor variations, some German, occasional traces of Native American ancestry. Nothing that would raise an eyebrow. But the family from the top of the mountain was a completely different story. Their results have been flagged by the Ancestry database software with error warnings that the geneticist had never seen before in all his years of running this kind of analysis. The Ancestry breakdown didn't add up. A significant percentage of their genome was classified simply as unknown archaic hominin. The software couldn't categorize it. It wasn't Neanderthal. It wasn't Denisovan. It didn't match any known reference population in the entire global database. The system essentially threw up its hands and said, "I don't know what this is." The geneticist assumed it was a lab error, contaminated sample, degraded DNA, some kind of processing glitch. It happens. He reran the samples through the same database, same result. He pulled fresh samples from the same family members and ran them through a different platform entirely. Same flags, same unknown archaic classification, same warning markers. He sent a subset of the samples to a colleague at another university for independent verification without telling the colleague what he expected to find or what he was looking for. The colleague came back a week later, deeply confused, and asked what on earth he was looking at, because whatever it wasn't matching anything in any reference database anywhere. The percentage of unknown archaic DNA in this one family was well above the upper range reported in the UCLA study. This wasn't a faint trace of ghost population DNA that required sophisticated statistical analysis to tease out of the noise. This family was saturated with it. The unknown markers were everywhere across their genome, concentrated and unmistakable, as if whatever ancient source had contributed this DNA had never been diluted by outside genetic material across all those generations. He started pulling at the thread. He requested deeper sequencing, targeting the specific chromosomal regions where the unknown markers were densest. He cross-referenced them against every archaic hominin genome in every public database he could access. The Neanderthal Genome Project, Denisovan reference sequences from the Max Planck Institute, even the fragmentary, degraded DNA recovered from ancient Homo erectus specimens in Asia. Nothing matched. Whatever species had contributed this DNA to this family's genome was not represented anywhere in the entire scientific record of human evolution. It was, by every available measure, a species that science had never encountered in any form, except as ghost code written into the chromosomes of living people in a mountain hollow in West Virginia. So he started digging into the family's genealogy through every available record. Public land deeds, county courthouse archives, census records going back to the 1800s, church baptism and marriage registers. Anything with a date and a name. The family had been in that exact hollow since at least the early 1800s. The oldest land deed he could find was from 1823, and the description of the property boundaries matched the land the family still occupied almost exactly. Before that, the records got murky, as if the family had simply appeared in the mountains one day without any prior documentation of where they came from or how they got there. There was no immigration record, no passage from another state, no trail of deeds or transactions leading back to somewhere else. They were just there, as if they had always been there. Marriage records showed an extreme pattern of endogamy, meaning the family almost exclusively married within their own bloodline, or with one or two other families in the immediate area who had similarly deep and undocumented roots. Very little genetic mixing with outside populations for generation after generation after generation. This explained everything about why the archaic markers were so concentrated. In most populations, archaic DNA gets watered down over the centuries as people marry outside their community and introduce new genetic material. Each generation of outbreeding dilutes the ancient traces a little more until they become barely detectable background noise. But in a family this isolated, married exclusively within their own community for 2 centuries or more, the opposite happened. The ghost DNA didn't fade, it accumulated. Each generation that married within the community reinforced those ancient Bigfoot markers until they reached concentrations that the ancestry software had never been programmed to handle, because no one ever imagined they would need to. To put it in simple terms, imagine you have a cup of coffee and you add a drop of cream. If you keep pouring in fresh coffee every day, that cream disappears. But if you never add fresh coffee, if you just keep that same cup and add another drop of cream every day for 200 years, eventually what you have isn't coffee with a trace of cream anymore. It's something fundamentally different. That is what happened with this family's genome. 2 centuries of genetic isolation didn't just preserve the ancient Bigfoot markers. It concentrated them to levels that made the unknown DNA not a footnote in their ancestry, but a defining feature of their genetic identity. The software flagged them because they literally did not fit into any existing model of what human DNA is supposed to look like. And the reason they didn't fit is because a significant portion of their genome isn't entirely human. It belongs to something else, something that science has detected, measured, and documented, but refuses to name. He also found old newspaper clippings and county records that referenced the family, and the descriptions raised every hair on the back of his neck. An 1890s county newspaper mentioned the giant clan up the mountain in a report about a land dispute, describing the family's patriarch as a man of extraordinary size and fearsome countenance. A 1920s census taker noted the family as unusual in physical stature and disposition. That's a remarkably personal observation for what was supposed to be a dry, bureaucratic head count. Census takers weren't supposed to editorialize. The fact that this one felt compelled to says something about how striking the family's appearance must have been. A 1950s sheriff's report mentioned responding to a complaint about strange sounds coming from the mountain above the family's property. The deputy described prolonged howling unlike any known animal in the region. The report was filed and apparently forgotten. Nobody followed up. The deeper the geneticist dug into the historical record, the more references he found to the family's unusual size, their preference for extreme isolation even by Appalachian standards, their comfort deep in the woods, and their neighbors' long-standing wariness. None of it was enough to prove anything on its own, but layered on top of the genetic data, it was forming a picture that he couldn't look away from no matter how much the rational, career-preserving part of his brain screamed at him to stop. He was not a Bigfoot believer. He needed that to be absolutely clear. He was a working scientist with a PhD, a tenure-track position, and a career built on rigorous methodology and peer-reviewed publications. He didn't watch Bigfoot documentaries. He didn't visit cryptozoology forums. He had never given Sasquatch a single serious thought in his entire professional life. The word Bigfoot had never appeared in any document he had ever written, and if someone had told him 6 months earlier that it ever would, he would have laughed them out of the room. But he couldn't ignore what the data was telling him. And the data was telling him something that made his stomach drop. He started reading the ghost population research with new eyes. The unknown species that left its DNA in modern humans diverged from the human lineage over 1 million years ago. That's far older than the Neanderthal split, which happened roughly 500 to 800,000 years ago. Whatever this ghost species was, it was ancient, genetically distinct, physically different from modern humans, and successful enough to survive alongside them for long enough to interbreed repeatedly across many generations. The DNA concentrations in certain populations ruled out a single chance encounter. This wasn't one Bigfoot meeting one human at one point in history. This was sustained, ongoing contact between two species over an enormous span of time. That means the unknown species was numerous enough to maintain breeding populations, smart enough to survive in proximity to humans, and widespread enough to leave its mark across diverse geographic regions. Then he started looking at geography. He pulled the published data on where the highest concentrations of unknown archaic DNA had been found and plotted them on a map. The elevated markers appeared overwhelmingly in populations from isolated, heavily forested, mountainous regions. Not cities, not coastal plains, not agricultural flatlands with high population mobility and constant genetic mixing. Deep forests, remote mountains, rugged terrain with low human population density and vast tracts of wilderness. Exactly the kind of terrain that Sasquatch sighting reports have been concentrated in for as long as anyone has been collecting them. He pulled the BFRO database, which is the most comprehensive collection of Bigfoot sighting reports in North America, and overlaid the sighting locations with the geographic origins of populations carrying elevated ghost DNA markers. The correlation wasn't perfect, and he knew that imperfect correlations don't prove causation. But it was far, far stronger than random chance would predict. The areas with the highest concentrations of unknown archaic DNA and the areas with the highest density of Sasquatch sightings overlapped with a consistency that would make any honest statistician pause. West Virginia, where this family lived, has one of the highest per capita rates of Bigfoot sightings in the entire United States. The specific county where the hollow is located has had reported Sasquatch encounters going back over 100 years. The surrounding Appalachian forests are vast, largely uninhabited, and contain terrain so rugged that large portions have never been systematically surveyed by anyone. He started to form a hypothesis that he could barely admit to himself. What if the ghost population isn't a ghost at all? What if it's a relic hominin species that never went extinct? A species that retreated deep into the most remote forests and mountains as human civilization expanded, avoiding contact, surviving in small scattered populations, and occasionally, rarely, encountering isolated human communities on the fringes of the wilderness. What if the thing that people have been calling Bigfoot and Sasquatch for centuries is the living descendant of this unknown archaic hominin species? And what if the DNA that scientists have already found and already published papers about isn't a trace of something ancient and dead, but a living signature of ongoing contact between two species that the scientific world considers impossible? He tried to find alternative explanations. He spent weeks looking for any other hypothesis that could account for the data without invoking a surviving archaic species. Maybe the unknown DNA came from an ancient population that went extinct so completely that all physical traces had been destroyed by deep time. Maybe the AI analysis was subtly flawed in ways nobody had caught yet. Maybe the family's results were an extreme statistical outlier that would normalize with a larger sample size. He tested every alternative, and each one fell apart under scrutiny. The AI methodology had been independently validated by multiple research teams across different institutions. The family's results had been confirmed by 3 separate laboratories using different platforms, and the geographic pattern he was documenting across other isolated communities made the random outlier hypothesis statistically untenable. Every rational alternative he explored led to a dead end. The only explanation that actually fit all of the data simultaneously was the one he desperately did not want to believe. He went back to the Hollow, this time not as a researcher handing out heritage breakdowns, but as someone looking for answers he wasn't sure he wanted to find. He was more observant on this second visit. He noticed things about the family that he had overlooked or dismissed during his first trip. The way they moved through the forest with an ease that seemed almost instinctual, stepping over roots and ducking branches without looking, as if the terrain was an extension of their own bodies rather than an obstacle to be navigated. Their unusual comfort in extreme cold. It was late November and temperatures were dropping into the 20s, but the family members he saw outside were wearing thin flannel shirts with no jackets, apparently unbothered. The geneticist was shivering in his insulated coat. Their reluctance to engage with modern technology was striking too. They had no interest in his laptop or his phone. They barely glanced at the genetic results he tried to share with them. The modern world seemed to hold no fascination for them whatsoever. He tried to ask careful questions about family history without revealing what he had found in the genetic data. The family's oldest living member, an elderly woman in her late 80s who still moved through the woods with a sureness that would embarrass most people half her age, sat on the porch and told him stories passed down through her family for as long as anyone could remember. She talked about the old ones who lived in the mountains before anyone else arrived. She described them as enormous, covered in dark hair, gentle unless provoked, and deeply connected to the forest in ways that ordinary people could never understand. She said her grandmother told her that the family's original patriarch came from the woods and that he wasn't like the others. She said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd mention that your grandfather was from Ohio or Pennsylvania. It wasn't a legend to her. It wasn't folklore. It was family history, spoken with the same casual certainty as any other biographical fact. The geneticist asked if she meant the patriarch was Native American or perhaps from another country. She shook her head slowly and said he was from the mountain, and that's all I know. She said it with a finality that made clear the conversation was over and that further questions on the subject would not be welcome. The other community members had their own stories, sounds in the woods at night that didn't match any animal they could identify. Large dark figures seen standing motionless at the tree line just before dark, watching, then gone. Rocks thrown at cabins during certain seasons, not aggressively but almost playfully, as if something was announcing its presence or testing a response. One older man said his father used to leave food on the back porch at night, and it would always be gone by morning. Sometimes it was replaced by a pile of fresh berries or a dead rabbit, laid neatly on the porch boards as if in exchange. They spoke about these things casually, the way people in tornado country talk about funnel clouds or people on the coast talk about hurricanes. It was just part of life in that hollow. Sasquatch in those woods weren't monsters to be feared. They were something closer to neighbors you didn't quite understand but had learned to live alongside. While visiting the area, the geneticist hiked into the forest surrounding the family's property. He told himself he was just getting a sense of the terrain for his research notes. That was only partly true. About 2 miles from the nearest house, in a creek bed that ran along the base of a steep ridge, he found massive footprints pressed deep into the soft mud. They were far larger than any human foot he had ever seen, with a stride length between them that suggested something well over 7 feet tall moving at a casual walking pace. The toes were clearly defined, 5 on each foot, spread wider than a human foot but with unmistakably primate anatomy. These were not bear tracks. Bears leave claw marks and have a completely different foot structure with a different weight distribution pattern. These were bipedal primate tracks, and they were fresh. The mud hadn't dried yet. Whatever made them had walked through that creek bed within the last day or two. Further up the ridge, he found tree structures, large branches woven together in deliberate, repeating patterns, arched and interlocked in formations that could not be explained by wind damage or natural tree fall. Some were 8 or 9 feet off the ground, bent and twisted into shapes that would require enormous strength to create. They were too organized, too symmetrical, and too consistently placed to be the result of any natural process. Some Bigfoot researchers call these formations Sasquatch tree structures or territorial markers, and they have been documented at sighting locations across North America for decades. The geneticist had never heard of them before, but standing in front of them in that quiet forest, he recognized immediately and instinctively that they were not natural formations. Something with hands and intention had built them. He also found a crude shelter built into a rock overhang about a quarter mile from the tree structures. The interior was lined with stripped bark and compressed moss arranged into something that unmistakably functioned as bedding. It was large enough for something much bigger than a human to curl up inside, and it was fresh. The bark wasn't dried out or decomposed. The moss was still green in places. Someone or something had been using it very recently. There was no evidence of modern tools or materials anywhere near it, no cut marks from a saw or hatchet. The branches framing the entrance had been broken by hand, snapped clean, and whatever hand had done, it possessed strength far beyond anything a normal person could generate. On the bark of a tree near the shelter, at roughly 7 to 8 feet off the ground, he found hair samples snagged on rough spots in the wood. Dark, coarse, long hairs caught in the bark the way animal fur catches on a fence post. He collected them carefully with tweezers and sterile evidence bags and later sent them to a lab that specialized in wildlife forensics and species identification. The results came back several weeks later, primate hair, but not matching any known primate species in North America. Not human, not bear, not any cataloged animal in the lab's reference database. The lab flagged it as unclassifiable and sent a follow-up email asking where he had collected the samples and whether there was any possibility of contamination from an exotic animal. He didn't answer the email. Each piece of evidence on its own could be explained away by a determined skeptic. Footprints can be hoaxed. Tree structures can be dismissed as storm damage by someone who has never seen them in person. Hair samples can be contaminated or degraded, but taken together, layered on top of the genetic data, the family's genealogical history, the geographic correlations between ghost DNA concentrations and Sasquatch sighting patterns, and the community's centuries of consistent first-hand accounts, they formed a pattern that the geneticist could no longer rationalize away no matter how hard he tried. Something was living in those woods, something large, bipedal, intelligent, and capable of avoiding detection by modern civilization while leaving traces that only someone looking carefully would ever find. And it shared DNA with the family at the top of the mountain. He sat in his truck that evening, parked at the edge of the hollow with the engine running and the heater on, and he tried to write objective field notes about what he had seen. But his hands were shaking and his mind kept circling back to one unavoidable conclusion. The ghost population that geneticists had identified in the human genome was not a ghost. It was not an abstract statistical artifact buried in ancient chromosomes. It was a living species. It was out there in those woods right now, building shelters, leaving tracks, shedding hair on tree bark. and it had been interbreeding with the most isolated members of human communities that shared its territory for centuries. The Sasquatch DNA in that family was not ancient. It was a living inheritance from a species that had never gone extinct, a species that mainstream science refused to acknowledge while simultaneously publishing papers that documented its genetic fingerprint in millions of people around the world. When he tried to share his findings with colleagues back at the university, the reaction was immediate and devastating. Other researchers refused to look at the data, not because they examined it and found methodological flaws, not because they identified errors in his analysis. They refused to engage with it at all once they understood where the conclusions pointed. The word Bigfoot acted like a kill switch on scientific curiosity. His department chair called him into the office and warned him directly and without any ambiguity that pursuing this line of inquiry would end his academic career. A colleague he had trusted for years told him bluntly that ghost population research was perfectly acceptable, even fashionable in genetic circles right now. But connecting it to Sasquatch was professional suicide. It didn't matter how strong the data was, the conclusion was unacceptable, and therefore the data that led to it was automatically suspect. He submitted a paper framing the findings in purely technical genetic terms. He didn't mention Bigfoot or Sasquatch anywhere in the manuscript. Not once. He described elevated concentrations of unknown archaic hominin markers in a geographically isolated population, discussed the implications for understanding archaic hominin survival and distribution patterns, and presented the data with meticulous methodology that followed every standard protocol in the field. The paper was rejected twice by 2 different journals. Reviewers called the sample size too small, the conclusions speculative, and the implications overstated. One reviewer wrote that the findings, if accurate, would fundamentally challenge accepted timelines of hominin extinction and should therefore require extraordinary evidence. The geneticist thought that was exactly what he was providing. The reviewers disagreed. He realized the scientific establishment had a blind spot so enormous that it functioned less like an oversight and more like a deliberate collective agreement to not see what was right in front of them. They were perfectly comfortable acknowledging that an unknown species' DNA exists in living humans. They published papers about it in top journals. They called it a ghost population and treated it as an interesting curiosity of ancient genomics, worthy of further study. But they were absolutely, categorically, career-endingly unwilling to take the next logical step and ask whether the species might not be a ghost at all, whether it might still be out there, whether the DNA they were studying might not be ancient at all but relatively recent, whether the thing hiding in the genome might also be hiding in the forest. That door was sealed shut, and anyone who tried to open it would be destroyed professionally. The geneticist shelved the paper but kept all his data backed up in multiple locations. He continued running the Ancestry Project across other Appalachian communities as his grant allowed, but he quietly flagged any samples that came back with elevated, unknown, archaic hominin markers. Over the next 2 years of fieldwork, he found a handful of other families in other states with the same pattern. Every single one lived in isolated, heavily forested, mountainous regions. Every single one had been rooted in the same area for generations with minimal outside genetic mixing. And every single one lived in areas with long, well-documented histories of Bigfoot sightings. The pattern held every time, and every time it held, it got harder to call it a coincidence. He started keeping a private map on his office wall with pins marking every location where he had found elevated ghost DNA markers, color-coded by concentration levels. Next to it, he pinned a second map showing Bigfoot sighting density by county across the eastern United States. The two maps looked almost identical. The clusters fell in the same places: the Appalachian Spine from West Virginia down through Kentucky and into the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina, the deep forests of northern Pennsylvania, the remote hollows of southeastern Ohio. Every pin on his genetic map had a corresponding cluster of Sasquatch sighting pins on the other. He knew that correlation does not equal causation. He had been trained to say that and believe it. But at a certain point, when the correlation is this consistent, this repeatable, and this geographically specific, dismissing it requires more faith than accepting it. Now let me step back from the story and tell you what all of this means if it's true, because the implications go far beyond one family in one hollow in West Virginia. If a relict hominin species survived into the modern era in remote forests and mountains, and if it occasionally interbred with isolated human populations living on the edges of that wilderness, then the ghost population DNA in modern humans isn't a relic of the distant past. It's a living genetic signature of ongoing contact between two species that mainstream science insists cannot possibly coexist. Sasquatch isn't just in the woods, Sasquatch is in the genome. And science has already found it. They just won't say what it is. This would explain why Bigfoot sightings have persisted across every continent and every culture for thousands of years. Every indigenous culture on Earth has stories of large, hairy, bipedal creatures living in the deep forests and mountains. The Sasquatch of the Pacific Northwest, the Yeti of the Himalayas, the Yowie of Australia, the Almasty of the Caucasus Mountains, the Orang Pendek of Sumatra, the Mapinguari of the Amazon. These aren't independent inventions of the same myth by people who had no contact with each other and no reason to fabricate identical stories. These are independent observations of the same reality. A large, intelligent, reclusive primate species that has been sharing this planet with humans for as long as humans have existed, staying just far enough in the shadows to avoid being caught, but close enough to leave traces in our stories, our folklore, and now, confirmed by artificial intelligence, in our DNA. The fossil record has massive gaps. Entire species have existed for millions of years and gone extinct without leaving a single bone behind for us to find. Fossilization requires incredibly specific conditions. The right soil chemistry, the right burial depth, the right temperature and moisture levels. The vast majority of organisms that have ever lived simply decomposed and vanished without a trace. The absence of Bigfoot fossils is not evidence that Bigfoot doesn't exist any more than the absence of fossil evidence for the ghost population meant it didn't exist. And we now know for certain that it did because its DNA is in living people. And if acidic forest soil can prevent fossilization of bones, which it absolutely can and does, then the deep forests where a large Sasquatch primate species would live and die are exactly the kind of environment where you would never expect to find fossils in the first place. And consider this. The giant panda was unknown to Western science until 1869. The mountain gorilla wasn't described until 1902. The okapi, a large forest-dwelling mammal in Central Africa, wasn't confirmed by scientists until 1901, despite the fact that local populations had known about it for centuries. Large, intelligent animals that live in dense forests and avoid human contact can remain undetected by science for extraordinarily long periods of time. The idea that a large primate species could exist in the vast, largely unexplored forests of North America without being officially cataloged is not as outlandish as it sounds when you look at how recently we discovered some of the largest animals alive today. The 19% figure is the key that unlocks everything. That is not a trace amount. That is an enormous genetic contribution from a single unknown source. Whatever this species was, it didn't have a single chance encounter with one human population in one location at one point in ancient history. It had sustained, repeated, widespread contact with human populations across a vast geographic range over thousands of years. That implies a species that was intelligent, mobile, adaptable, socially complex, and numerous enough to maintain viable breeding populations across multiple continents. In other words, it implies a species that was enormously successful, and successful species don't just vanish from the face of the earth without leaving anything behind, unless they didn't vanish at all. The family in the hollow is still there, still living the way they've always lived, still carrying Bigfoot DNA that science can detect and measure and analyze but cannot explain and will not investigate further. The geneticist still has the data, every sample, every analysis, every cross-reference, every geographic overlay. He still believes what he found, but he knows that saying it publicly would cost him his career, his reputation, and his ability to do the work that led him to the discovery in the first place. So the data sits in an encrypted hard drive in his home office, and the family sits on their mountain surrounded by forest that goes on for hundreds of miles in every direction. And Sasquatch continues to be classified as a myth by the same scientific establishment that has already found its genetic fingerprint in living humans and published papers about it in peer-reviewed journals. And maybe that is the most unsettling part of all of this. Not the footprints in the creek bed, not the tree structures on the ridge, not the hair samples or the family stories or the sounds that echo through dark Appalachian forests at night. The most unsettling thing is that science has already found the proof. They have already published it, they have already acknowledged it, and then they collectively decided to look the other way. The ghost population exists in the data. It is confirmed. It is repeatable, it is in the journals, but the moment you ask the obvious follow-up question, what was this species and could it still be alive? The entire scientific establishment goes silent. That silence is not based on evidence, it is based on fear. Fear of ridicule, fear of losing funding, fear of being the researcher who says the word Bigfoot out loud in a room full of colleagues. And as long as that fear is stronger than scientific curiosity, the truth will stay exactly where it is, hidden in plain sight, written in the blood of millions of people who have no idea what they are carrying inside them. Here's what I want you to think about tonight. Millions of people around the world carry DNA from a species that has never been identified. No fossils, no bones, no official name, no entry in any taxonomy, just code. Ancient, unknown, unclassifiable code running through their veins. If Bigfoot is just a myth, then what left its genetic fingerprint in up to 19% of some people's DNA? If the ghost population is truly extinct, gone forever, wiped from the face of the earth hundreds of thousands of years ago, then why can't science find a single fossil, a single bone, a single tooth to prove it ever existed in physical form? And if Sasquatch is still out there right now, tonight, living in the same deep forests where sighting reports have never stopped coming in year after year after year, then the proof of its existence isn't hidden in the woods waiting to be discovered by some lucky trail camera. The proof is already in our blood. Science has already found it. They've already sequenced it. They've already published papers about it. They just don't know what to call it yet. Or maybe they do know and they're afraid to say it out loud. Because admitting that Bigfoot is real means admitting that everything we think we know about what shares this planet with us is incomplete. And that's a door that once you open, it can never be closed again. For more interesting stories, check this out.